Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Innovation World Young Collaborators Podcast Series. I'm Neha Sada, and this is the space where we amplify teen changemakers, startup founders, and student leaders who are not waiting to grow up to shake things up. Today's guest is insane. He's bold, he's driven, and he's showing the world what happens when you mix action with empathy. Meet Kofi Hair-Ralston, a rising junior from Baltimore, the founder of VentureEd and Egg Labs. He's already built platforms that are giving hundreds of underrepresented high schoolers access to internships, mentorship, and startup support globally. This episode is for the dreamers who don't want to just imagine, they want to do. Let's get into it. Kofi, welcome. I always start with this. Who are you when no one's watching, and what's the story behind the Kofi we're seeing today?
Hi, Nika. Thanks so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here. To start story-wise, just for a little bit of background on myself, like you said, I'm a junior here in Baltimore, and in Baltimore, I see a ton of awesome people who are my age who are building really great things. I've always been a builder myself into programming, and so I sort of fell in love with the startup world a couple years ago, mainly through online platforms, right, through X and YouTube and other ways like that. I found out about how easy it was for people to start companies and how often it happened. Right? You hear stories about Google and Facebook and all of these other very large organizations, and they're very cool stories, but there are hundreds of others that we don't hear about every day, and that piqued my interest. And since then, I've been obsessed with startups.
Okay, excellent. So, do you believe that the internet had a very great or influential role in shaping the journey that you've sort of gone through these past few years, and the city that you've grown up in? You said you've grown up in Baltimore, correct? So, like, how has your city influenced you?
Great question. So environment-wise, I do think that yes, both the internet and the city that I grew up in were very large factors in my interests and what came out of my interests. Specifically, living in Baltimore, well, Baltimore's an extremely diverse city, right? You meet people from every single different walk of life, people who are, gardeners, and people who are painters, and there's so much art and so much diverse culture here in Baltimore that you could take a walk 3 blocks and be in a completely different world. So that is one of the reasons why I started sort of talking to a ton of different builders is because there are so many. So many people from different cultures means they have different problems to solve. So there are a lot of different small businesses. There are some places with a ton of different barbershops, some car shops, mechanics, different sort of stories that start different problems and thus different solutions. And the internet is the exact same thing, right? You have a great eclectic variety of, very diverse people as well, who all have their own problems to solve, and that's where great business ideas come from. So yeah, I mean, in terms of my own specific journey with the internet, I spent an ungodly amount of time on YouTube as a kid. A lot of it was watching, video game channels and things like that. But I think YC's YouTube channel was one of the places where I first understood like startup culture in San Francisco and how it started in the way that so many people, as like young as, college students especially, were starting these great companies and doing, this sort of magical process of, taking a problem and turning it into a product with just a couple lines of code. And after that, I got into some programming. Some of it was through my school, some of it was through just, some self-teaching. And after that, I met some other cool people who are also in the programming scene.
Okay, wow, that's really inspiring and exciting. So, we're going to talk a little about your work now. So, let's talk about VentureEd. What is it? Who's it for? And how did the idea really start?
Yeah, so VentureEd is a platform that connects a global group of mainly underrepresented students get internships and first jobs in tech. So to start with the story behind VentureEd, again, I told you that, I was very, very lucky to be brought up in such an eclectic place with so many opportunities and so many entrepreneurs that I was exposed to the idea of entrepreneurship young. That, in combination with learning about tech young, brought me into the tech scene from a very, very young age. And again, this is like sort of a very lucky combination of events that brought me here. But I do believe that really getting into the scene young and understanding that people really can build and do anything from a very, very young age has been a part of the reason why I've, started to do these projects and help other people out. So VentureEd is supposed to sort of share that with some other people, hopefully get people, interested in tech, starting to talk to like a group of other people their age and a group of other people who are not their age as well. Because, I know for myself, sort of entering at a couple tech companies was great for my initial experiences because on the one hand, I was, learning from other people who I was working with. And then on the other hand, I was learning from the people who I was working for, right? The executives in the tech companies, especially with smaller tech companies, you'll be talking a lot with specifically like the CEO and other people at that executive level, which was really great to see. Because the idea of a CEO, I think of like the TV show Suits, for example, right? It's these people who went to these like big schools and like learned a certain like language and show up in suits every day. But one thing I love about startup culture today is that it's kind of the opposite, right? It's these really like scrappy, like funny, sort of quirky people who just like build something that matters to them. So I was trying to share that with as many other people as possible, and yeah, it's grown into something that I'm very proud of.
Okay, that's excellent. So you said you launched the application before having partners, and that's wild, honestly. So what was going through your head at that time? And what's one student success story that made you go that, yup, this is why I did this?
Yeah, okay. That's a great question. So one thing that I guess it's kind of a mistake that I made at the beginning, that I'm sure a lot of other people make from talking to a few other people, is sort of emulating successes. And one instance of this is, do you know the movie The Social Network? Okay,
No, I
well,
don't.
yeah, I mean it's one of the movies that's sort of like a stereotypical like startup bro movie, where it's the movie that sort of describes the story of how Mark Zuckerberg started Facebook. And that sort of becomes like a Bible for a lot of people, right? It's a lot of, sort of hacking in the middle of the night, building a site really, really fast, flying to San Francisco, getting great investors, and like doing it all like in a hoodie, for example. So that was sort of like my model of this at first because it was so contrary to what I thought starting a company meant, right? The boardrooms and sort of like stuffy corporate speak. And one thing that I took out of that, which I'm lucky that I took this and not a couple of the other things, was to take big risks, right? If you don't take risks, nothing good is going to happen. So I could have waited to have partners, but that wasn't working because at first my outreach was, super brute force. I would go like on LinkedIn or like to I'll talk about that later. But I would go on LinkedIn and I would just search for a ton of companies and find the ones that really spoke to me and just like incessantly email all the founders of these companies to see if they would be interested in this opportunity. Like, hey, do you guys want to have like a couple like great motivated students working at your organization? And a lot of the time they answered no, because it is a big ask of them. But I sent hundreds and hundreds of LinkedIn DMs from a couple of different accounts. I got two or three of them banned. And I got kind of crazy about this. I would, sort of send like physical mail to the businesses to try and like stand out a little bit more in my outreach, which is kind of interesting. It was definitely a great experience. But I ended up just sort of opening the application because my thought was this: if I had something like, hey, we have hundreds of students who are like waiting for these first opportunities who are really cool, it would be a better deal for them. As for some success stories, there's one student, I won't, give like a specific like name, but this one student who was in our first winter cohort at Jamie, who ended up joining the company after and is now like leading one of their product sort of like sectors. And it's great to see because you see this person like on LinkedIn promoting the product all the time, and it's sort of great to sort of smile back and think that I had like some role to play.
Honestly, I think this is the moment where you think that, oh my God, everything is finally working out, and you're actually sort of proud of yourself for, sort of taking initiative up like this, like when she read. Now we're talking about Egg Labs. Okay. So you ideated, built, and launched it in a week. What even was that week like?
Yeah. Okay. This is a great question. So Egg Labs is a sort of student incubator. The idea is to help other people start projects, kind of like venture ed. So a few friends of mine are also sort of like in a similar position to me, where, by nature of some of their experiences, they found problems that they like to solve and started their own organizations to try and solve them. Um, and my idea is that really everyone has their own unique story to tell. That's kind of, why I started venture in the first place. But because of this, there are so many different organizations that could be started, right? It's not just venture, right? It's not like some like hero thing. It's just like something that's personal to me, and I thought that I could help other people out with. So the idea behind Egg Labs is to help other people do the exact same thing. There are two sort of facets. The first is a lot of students who did start sort of charitable organizations or other things like that will go off to college and then will sort of disappear. And that's kind of obviously bad for the beneficiaries because to them it just seems like this opportunity that existed just melted into thin air. So the initial idea was to continue these on and help these organizations continue on after the original founder went off to college and like became a lot more busy. And then we ended up sort of expanding a little bit into an organization where we just like help other people sort of start and maintain their organizations. So as for the launch story, um, I think like 2 or 3 days after school ended this summer, we just got like we set up like an iMessage group chat, just started texting a couple of ideas. And then by the end of the night, we had like a name sort of idea and a website up. That's all we had. And from there, we sort of figured things out. We started first off with recruiting a ton of great people who started their own organizations to sort of have like as many minds as possible on the problem. And then from there, we just opened up an application and started doing as much as we could to help people out.
Okay. So do you still feel pressure to keep everything moving fast, or like have you sort of found your own rhythm, like we call it?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of people say like move fast and break things. It's sort of their model. Um, and I think it's good to start and sort of to eliminate some analysis paralysis. But I think in general, that's not necessarily something you should aim for. At least in my experiences, trying to move as fast as possible isn't always the best decision, but trying to make decisions as quickly as possible is. So, if, for example, we wanted to make a new website for VentureEd, this was something that a mistake that I made. I procrastinated for like 6 months on a new website design, and we finally do have a new one out, but um, that could have been made in like 2 or 3 minutes with a text group chat, and that's sort of like the decision making speed that we want to have, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to spend a day or two on the site itself, right? We can spend as much time on the site, make it look nice and whatever else, but just don't dwell on decisions, and after that move at whatever speed feels right.
Okay. So how do you decide which ideas are worth chasing and which ones to let go?
Okay. This is a great idea as well. A great question as well. I hear a lot of people who ask me about starting an organization, either, like, how do I know if my idea is good or like, where do I find new ideas? And I think those are kind of the wrong questions because when it comes to ideas, I think they should just be related to your life, specifically. Kind of like, venture ed comes from like my experience and seeing who is in tech. And it wasn't like an idea. I was like, I wasn't, doing some soul searching and thinking about like ways that I could start an organization to solve it. It was just sort of like a thought that crossed my mind one day. Like, it would be pretty cool if other people could also, just like have a platform to join these tech companies, and just like make it happen. Right. So my sort of system for this is don't think of it as an organization. Just learn to recognize problems as they float past your mind and act on them as quickly as possible. And then the second part of the question was how to figure out if an idea is good or worth chasing. Um, I don't, right? For me, sort of like with Egg Labs, for example, I just sort of execute on the idea pretty fast. And then it's pretty easy to tell from there if it works based on people's responses. So with Egg Labs, we had like dozens of responses like within a couple days. So we knew that there was some demand for it. But if we opened up the application and like posted it on LinkedIn a couple times and nobody signed up, then that would also be just like a very useful piece of information about whether or not the idea is worth chasing.
Okay, awesome. So you've had over 320 fellows from 39 countries. That's more than many adult run startups. But beyond the numbers, what impact matters most to you?
Yeah. So, um, we did a grant application last spring, and I was talking with one of the people who ended up accepting the grant, and she told me that the reason why this idea was so compelling was because it really positively impacts everyone, including the companies. And that's sort of something that we hadn't done a lot of research into, but now looking into the companies themselves, right, having a tech startup that now has like far more unique voices inside of it will inevitably do way better, right? There's a lot of data on this. There was a study done in the EU across like a lot of like legacy companies as well. And companies that had like more women in the companies ended up doing way better. It has nothing to do with like anyone's like identity or diversity itself, but just having more unique ideas in a company and then more like diverse ideas means that you're going to be able to have more good ones. This is another like one of the reasons why I sort of love venture. It is sort of the economic benefit. So to zoom out, ideally in a world of like actually let's look at the tech world right now. A lot of people come from like the same like three schools. They're all like in the San Francisco area. They all like learn like to code at age 6 in the same sort of like environments. The problem with that is we get bubbles. You look at the AI bubble right now, or like the dot-com bubble, everyone's chasing the exact same ideas because they have the same life experiences. If something like VentureEd succeeds and we're able to have, more diverse people from different parts of the world in these tech companies in the future, then not everyone will have the same ideas, right? Because, everyone will have different life experiences and thus have ideas for different problems to solve.
Okay. So, with so many applicants, how do you choose? Like, what matters more to you? Is it potential or is it polish? And have you ever taken a chance on someone who wasn't the most qualified on paper, but they totally wowed you after with what they did?
Yes. Okay. Absolutely. The answer to the question is potential. And there are a couple reasons for this. First off, like grades and a lot of traditional accolades are things that people can like really choose to focus on, right? For example, if you have person A who's really deep into startups and they love tech and really want to work at a tech startup, and person B who does not at all, either of them can, choose to spend 3 hours a day studying if they really want to. So, what the grades end up being is kind of irrelevant. But if someone does have high grades, one thing that it does tell you is that they can have high grades. So that's all it really does. And so otherwise, it's not really relevant. As for other kinds of ways to figure this out, the majority of the venture application is like really short essays. So you can just sort of like hear in their voice and their story, A, their conviction, and B, their reasons for it. So if you can sort of like understand and be like a little bit empathetic and put yourself in their shoes and try to just like gauge how much they would be able to contribute and like how excited they are about the proposition and idea, that will give you a way better group of people with more life experiences. Because we don't just want everyone who's like the best at getting straight A's. And as for taking chances on people, uh, in the admissions process, we have like a big spreadsheet and we have like people go through how like score all the applicants. And so what we did is we sort of like removed the grades and the school and like the location, those kinds of things, and only had people just like look at the essays, for example. And it turns out that group of people was like ended up being like far, far, far better cohort in this cohort recently in terms of like, the diversity that we were able to bring to the table, and the sort of underrepresented voices we could have represented.
Okay, awesome. I think empathy honestly goes a very long way, and potential will always beat straight A's, obviously. Now, you're going off to college pretty soon, I think in 2 years, correct? So, what happens to Venture Ed and Egg Labs then?
Okay. I've thought about this a little bit, and my plan and goal right now is just to continue working on these as long as I can, um, into my professional life if possible. And obviously this is like a big undertaking, but I'm lucky to have like a great network of people who are, current college students, who are like working on their own organizations and things. And it's definitely possible to do. And I would like to try to do it as much as possible and stay involved as much as I can. If it ends up that I'm extremely busy, then I may be able to like change my role a little bit, but I'm definitely like not willing to sort of drop these things. It's my little sunk cost fallacy. These are my babies, and I kind of want to stick with them as long as possible.
Okay, awesome. I love that. So, final deep question. So, what's one thing you've learned from these journeys and one thing you've had to unlearn?
Okay. All right, this is great. One thing I've learned is that leadership, when your goal is like a mission and not necessarily money, is very, very different. Instead of being a leader, like, for example, in like a school club for something where you like take care of all the schedules and just like do all the administrative stuff, the goal is to like make sure that everyone's voices are heard and do a lot of like introspection impartially. So I'm not necessarily the voice that everyone listens to because we have a mission that does that job. But I'm just sort of in charge and making sure that we're like steering in the right direction, which is like a little bit more difficult to learn how to do, but it's 100% like it's far, far more fun. And I really enjoy it. As for unlearning, um, again, sort of from like school leadership positions, for example, I have always like had to sort of be a little bit more like professional, whatever that means, right? Speak a little bit less often, use like, big words and like sort of fancy like emails and like have like a weekly meeting and those kinds of things. And I've sort of had to like unlearn most of those things because they're like mainly distractions, right? If I can like talk in like my honest voice, and just be more impartial and like, talk about like, hey, I think this, I have no idea why this is, it's probably wrong, and have those kinds of like admittances and be more honest in terms of leadership, which I think has been a very, very great skill for my own communication.
That was all for the deep questions we have. We're just gonna do like a little fun question sort of around right now. So, what's your go-to hype song before a pitch or like a big meeting that you're really nervous about? Something that calms you down.
Okay. I know I mentioned this movie before, The Social Network, but their soundtrack is great. I like the song In Motion by Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross.
Okay. And what's one startup that you're secretly obsessed with right now?
Ooh, this is a great question. A lot of people were talking about Cluely right now.
hmm
So yeah, that's one I've always kept tabs on.
Okay. And if Egg Labs, for example, had a mascot, what would it be?
Okay, I'm thinking obviously an egg, but sort of in the shape of, the driving instructor from SpongeBob, like sort of a little bit like that.
Okay, excellent. So, Kofi, your journey is what this podcast is all about. You've shown us that action is the best strategy and that real change doesn't wait for credentials. If you're listening right now and holding on to an idea, maybe you're scared, maybe you think it's not ready, take this episode as your sign. Launch it, build fast, grow with it. You can follow Kofi and his work with Venture Ed and Egg Labs. And that's a wrap on this episode of the Young Collaborators Podcast Series on Innovation World. Kofi, thank you for reminding us that age doesn't define ability and that moving fast with heart can actually change the world. To everyone listening, don't just dream big, dare to start. Your idea might just be the next venture at Direct Labs. This is your host, Neha Sarda, signing off. Catch you in the next one. Until next time, keep collaborating, keep innovating, stay too curious to settle, and keep believing that your age is your edge.
All right, thanks, Neha.